Hi, I'm Mike Gafa, and for today's Whiteboard Wednesday, I want to talk to you about something called the Control Continuum. My first exposure to this was when I was teaching Franklin Covey time management. Stephen Covey used to do some teaching around this, some writing and teaching, and I want to share with you some thoughts that I have. First of all, the Control Continuum on the bottom part are things that we have no control over. So when you ask people, well, what is it that you don't have control over, the first thing most people say is the weather. And that's a good example. On the other hand, on the other side of the spectrum, are things that we do control. And if you ask the same question, what is it that we control, most people would say, well, we can control our emotions, our attitude, things like that. The applicability for this for church leaders and for whole churches is we spend, more often than maybe we care to admit, too much time trying to control things that we can't control, and not enough time not taking control over things that we can control. So the key words here are release. If there's something you can't control, the weather again is a good example, and that does impact churches. As I speak, we're entering winter, and it's possible that there may be a Sunday or two that are washed out due to weather. And it's impossible to predict, but it can happen. And we can't obsess over what that wants to look like. Instead, we just got to release that and go with the flow. On the other hand, there are things that we need to control, and there we need to take control. Our leadership issues, in Revelation, one of the 7 churches there is the church of Thyatira, and Jesus, in instructing John what to write, talks about how there was a Jezebel, quote unquote, probably wasn't her real name, but there was a person who was influencing the church from the outside in and causing all sort of havoc, and at no point in time did the leaders deal with the problem. They never took control when they needed to take control. Now, in between these two extremes of not taking or no control, where we need to sort of let that go, and taking control, is there's a large spectrum that we can call influence. And that's primarily where leadership resides, in this spectrum of influence. There are things that we can control, and there's appropriate times when we need to do that. There are things that we need to release, but mostly the road of leadership is a lot of influence. One of my favorite examples, I think, in Scripture is Acts chapter 17. So the chapter begins, we find Paul in Thessalonica, and things are going okay until this group of angry people who don't agree with the teaching basically are ready to put him to death. And so the Scripture says the believers had Paul leave for Berea, and things were going great in Berea. Bible says that the people there were receiving the word. They had open hearts, more open hearts than the people in Thessalonica. However, the angry mob from Thessalonica then shows up in Berea, and they're about to take action, drastic action. And so again, the Scripture says that the believers, in both cases, moving Paul out of Thessalonica into Berea, and out of Berea now next into Athens, that the believers had Paul move on. And so they took control, appropriately so. Paul had no ability to control this angry mob. I mean, he was proclaiming truth, he just couldn't control what they did. But then it gets really interesting in Athens, where we find Paul ahead of the others. And Athens is like no culture that Paul had ever encountered. It is an elitist, intellectual, very ethereal sort of culture. And so he goes there, and the first thing we read is that Paul is greatly distressed by a city overrun by idols. But he doesn't abdicate. He doesn't go into the place of, I can't control that. Instead, he begins to influence. And he ends up at the Areopagus, which is sort of their Mars Hill, the Supreme Court, if you will, and gives this very unconventional gospel presentation where he starts by touching on creation. He ends up quoting not one, but 2 Greek poets, That's a language they would understand there. And then he closes with the resurrection. And the scripture at the end says that some sneered, but others were intrigued and wanted to know more. And it doesn't close with that a group of people had immediately come to Christ. There's no Acts 2 sort of cut to the heart. Instead, it says, we're in so many words, it says we're intrigued and we want to know more. And so, interestingly, the way Scripture says this, I believe it's verse 32, is that some followed Paul, ... and believed. So in other words, this influence was one where Paul had to really connect with them at an intellectual level because that was the culture. And so he didn't abdicate, he didn't take too much control, he exerted appropriate leadership influence, and some not only followed him, but they ended up believing in the gospel. They followed Jesus ultimately. So when we don't control, when we can't control something, we need to learn how to release it. When we can control things, we need to take control. And most often, we need to know where we can influence and be influencers of the people around us and in our churches. So there's your Whiteboard Wednesday.